For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello, and welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet, and I'm happy to announce that we have now completed our discussion of the first woe in Revelation 9, verses 1 through 11, and also the transition verse between the first woe and the second woe in Revelation 9:12. Today, we're ready to move on in our discussion of the second woe. The second woe is a little bit like an elephant that you have to eat. And how do you eat an elephant? Well, you got to do it one bite at a time. So today, I'm going to give you the overview only of what you can expect as part of the second woe. The nutshell version of this podcast can be found at section 117 of my book. John describes the events of the second woe primarily in Revelation 9, verse 13 through Revelation 11, verse 14. Now keep in mind, the first woe had 11 verses, and now we have 34 verses in 2.5 chapters that describe the second woe. These 34 verses coincide with the 7-year battle of Armageddon. There's a great diversity of thought as to what verses describe the period of the second woe in the book of Revelation. Some say that Armageddon is only described in the 9 verses between Revelation 9:13 and Revelation 9:21. Donald W. Perry shares this view and describes other divisions of opinion as follows, quote, "Some scriptural scholars believe that this passage," and he's speaking here of Revelation 9:13 through 21, "is a description of the war of Armageddon." And they may well be correct. The army described here is so huge and the number of dead so astounding that one wonders how it could be anything other than Armageddon. Their reasoning is based in part on the belief that the 7 trumpets of judgment in Revelation 8, 9, and 11, which include the war, and the 7 vials of judgment poured out in Revelation 16, which includes Armageddon, are different descriptions of the same events. The similarities are indeed striking, yet the differences seem to argue that the war described in Revelation 9:13 through 21 is not the same as that described in Revelation 16:12 through 16. Brother Perry is correct in stating that Armageddon is described in Revelation 9:13 through 21. He's also correct that Revelation 16, verses 12 through 16, do not describe the same battle. Remember, as I've said before, we have a physical battle of Armageddon and we have a spiritual battle of Armageddon. The physical battle occurs in Revelation 9, and the spiritual battle occurs in Revelation 16. He's also correct in stating that Revelation 11 includes a description of events that occur during the Battle of Armageddon, but he misses the mark by skipping chapter 10 as part of the second woe. Revelation 10 describes events that occur at the midpoint of Armageddon. Now, the midpoint, since we're talking here about a 7-year battle, the midpoint would fall 3.5 years into the battle. At the midpoint of Armageddon, the saints will secretly gather at Adam-ondi-Ahman in Missouri, as foreseen by Daniel the prophet in Daniel 7 and Daniel 9. Bruce R. McConkie shares insights into this coming attraction when he said, quote, "On May 19, 1838, Joseph Smith and a number of his associates stood on the remainder of the pile of stones at a place called Spring Hill, Daviess County, Missouri. There, the prophet taught them that Adam again would come in the valley of Adam-ondi-Ahman, holding a great council as a prelude to the great and dreadful day of the Lord. At this council, all who have held keys of authority will give an accounting of their stewardship to Adam. Christ will then come, receive back the keys, and thus take one of the final steps preparatory to reigning personally upon the earth. Close quote. Now note that in this particular verse, Bruce R. McConkie is citing Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14 in support of his description of Adam-ondi-Ahman. John, on the other hand, symbolically describes this latter-day gathering in Revelation chapter 10, starting with the image of a mighty angel that delivers a little book to John, which includes a commission for John to prepare the lost 10 tribes to, number 1, attend the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, and 2, for their ultimate return from the land of the north at the second coming. Now, Joseph Smith helps us out with this interpretation of Revelation chapter 10 in Doctrine and Covenants, section 77, verse 14, which states, quote, "What are we to understand by the little book which was eaten by John as mentioned in the 10th chapter of Revelation?" Answer, we are to understand that it was a mission and an ordinance for him to gather the tribes of Israel. Close quote. So how do we know that John's gathering of the tribes of Israel in Revelation 77:14 refers to the lost 10 tribes as opposed to the tribes that are not lost? The answer is very simple, and it can be found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 110, verse 11, which describes the appearance of Moses to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple on April 3, 1836, where Moses, quote, "committed unto us," that is Joseph and Oliver, "the keys of the gathering of Israel from the 4 parts of the earth, and leading of the 10 tribes from the land of the north." Close quote. Now note, the key of gathering Israel went to Joseph and Oliver and was subsequently handed down to each and every president of the church until those same keys are held by President Nelson. We also have the key of the leading of the 10 tribes from the north, which also went to Joseph Smith and subsequently to the president of the church today. So what gathering keys were given to John in Revelation 10 as described in Doctrine and Covenants, section 77? Because again, Joseph got the keys of the gathering of Israel, and he got the keys of leading the 10 tribes from the north. You can't have those same keys given to John. In this instance, we must be talking about different keys. And the reason they can't be the same keys is because that would be inconsistent with the order of heaven, where only one person ultimately holds the keys of a certain event or certain actions, ordinances, whatever the case might be. You can't have different people holding the same keys with the power to exercise them at the same time. Since Joseph and Oliver got the gathering keys for Israel that is not lost, and the key of leading the 10 tribes from the north, the only keys that John could have gotten were the keys of gathering the lost 10 tribes. Now note there's a distinction between gathering the tribes of Israel on the one hand and leading the 10 tribes from the north on the other hand. So essentially what we have between Doctrine and Covenants, section 77, verse 14, and D&C 110, verse 11, are 3 different types of keys. In 77:14, John received the keys to gather the tribes of Israel. That must necessarily be the lost 10 tribes of Israel, or we have a conflict with Doctrine and Covenants, section 110, verse 11, because in that verse, Joseph Smith received the keys of the gathering of Israel from the four parts of the earth. Notice, we're not here talking about the lost 10 tribes that come from the land of the north. That verse is specific in telling us that Joseph received the keys of the gathering of Israel from the four parts of the earth. In other words, those remnants of the house of Israel that are spread abroad and are not lost. Finally, in Doctrine and Covenants, section 110, verse 11, Joseph received the keys for the leading of the 10 tribes from the land of the north. Not from the four parts of the earth, but from the land of the north. Very distinct. And the reason they're distinct is because you have the lost 10 tribes in the north, and you have the remnant, everybody else of the house of Israel, in the four parts of the earth. So once we understand the nature of the keys that John holds as part of his little book mission described in Revelation 10, it's easy to see how this comes into play at the midpoint of Armageddon. So let's take a step back and review what's occurring during the second woe that we call Armageddon. In Revelation 9, verses 13 through 21, you generally get an overview or summary of the entire 7-year battle of Armageddon. So that takes us to the end of chapter 9. Then in chapter 10, it starts talking about the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman. And as I have mentioned, and we'll talk about in future podcasts, this occurs at the midpoint of Armageddon, or 3.5 years into the Battle of Armageddon. That's why John received his little book mission, was to prepare the lost 10 tribes to make their appearance at Adam-ondi-Ahman. Now, after you get past Revelation 10, you roll right into Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, that talks about, guess what? The last half of Armageddon, or that last 3.5 years before the second coming, when the two witnesses will minister in Jerusalem. It's all chronological. There are no skips in the account, and nothing repeats itself. Remember our basic rules of interpretation for the book of Revelation. John records the events chronologically, and he doesn't repeat. He also doesn't go down these rabbit holes that some people call interludes, that I'll talk about in more detail later on. I kind of gave my initial thoughts on the concept of interludes in a podcast that I did on October 22nd, 2023. So if you're wondering what an interlude is and would like more information about that, check out that podcast on October 22nd, 2023. So Armageddon begins in Revelation 9:13, when the sixth trumpet angel sounds his trumpet. In Revelation verses 9:13 through 21, the four destroying angels use their evil influence to assemble actual armies totaling 200 million people, as described by John, for this epic battle. A third part of all the mortal combatants in this battle will die, as recorded in Revelation 9:15, which says, quote, "And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men." Close quote. As I've noted before in my last podcast, Armageddon will have a very specific start date. There will be a trigger that I'll talk about once we get to my discussion in Revelation 9:15. And keep in mind once again that here we have the 1/3 of something. In this case, we have the 1/3 part of men who will die during the Battle of Armageddon. Keep in mind that the 1/3 is a qualitative measurement, not a quantitative measure. It's not a mathematical equation of numerical deaths where 1/3 of 200 million is going to be roughly 67 million people in round numbers. It's all qualitative, and what is qualitative about it is that it pertains to all mortal sons of perdition who will die as a group collectively. So we're going to find, and I'll talk about it in more detail, that there is an order of destruction that goes from the worst, sons of perdition, to the less than worst, which are the telestial people. So we've heard time and time again that the only people that are going to survive and be able to live during the millennium are those who are at least terrestrial worthy. So in order for only terrestrial people to survive into the millennium, we got to get rid of people who are either telestial worthy, that's one step down, or the next and lowest step down are the sons of perdition. So we're going to begin in the physical battle of Armageddon, killing off the first and worst group, sons of perdition. And it might be far, far less than 67 million people. Keep in mind as you try and do the math in your head as to the number of mortal sons of perdition that may and will exist on the earth by the time of the second coming, it could be far, far less than 67 million. That's why we're talking about a qualitative measure as opposed to a quantitative measure. So we're saying essentially those that go first are sons of perdition. Does that mean nobody else of some other status is going to also die? The answer is yeah. There will be collateral damage, there will be collateral deaths, but we're talking about as a group, the sons of perdition are first to die in the second woe. And then as a group, the telestial people will die during the third woe, leaving only terrestrial and celestial people upon the earth. So again, does that mean that during the third woe, only telestial people will die? And the answer is no. There could be a few hanging out from the sons of perdition. Could also mean that there will be terrestrial people that will die. There will be celestial people that will die. But we're talking about these groups generally dying in order, in their prescribed order as a group. So the second woe is extremely complex, and it lasts the longest of the three woes. In writing about the second woe, John kind of assumes that we know more than we often do actually know about it. He talks about things that must occur in the great winding up seat. So why the complexity? First, the first woe is 5 months, and it's covered in Revelation 9, verses 1 through 11. Now, it took us multiple podcasts just to get through those 11 verses, and it's not rocket science. There's just this time of great spiritual darkness and the power of evil spirits. Now, on the other hand, the third woe happens very, very rapidly, probably taking days at most. By then, the die is cast on the fulfillment of most of the second coming prophecies. Many of the signs of the times will have already occurred, or they will occur during the period of the third woe, because it's a very, very short period of time. That then leaves us with the second woe. 7 years and 34 verses of symbolic details for the events of the 7-year Battle of Armageddon to occur. Now, certain events are what we call predecessor activities to the second coming. So, as you know, in my professional life, I was a litigation attorney. I was a trial attorney, and I did a lot of construction litigation. So I worked with a lot of scheduling experts to unravel the details of who was responsible for project delays in these buildings that were the subject of lawsuits in which I was one of the attorneys. So I had various jobs that were being litigated where the liquidated damages were $5,000 a day for every day of delay. That is, for every day that the job went late, the contractor would have to pay $5,000 in liquidated damages. Now, some of the jobs I was working on went over by months or even years. So this gets really expensive really fast. And when this begins to happen, there's lots of finger pointing, my client at someone else at my client, and a whole bunch of these subcontractors all saying, he caused the delay. No, he caused the delay. So we have to do an entire schedule of what delays were critical on the project. So when we're talking about a critical delay, we're talking about a delay that actually extends the duration of the project, because not every delay in your work will cause the end date to be elongated. So maybe my work wasn't done in the time frame that I was scheduled, but that doesn't mean that I caused a delay to the completion date. There might be a dozen contractors on the site, but only one of them has the work that is actually controlling the critical end date. Also, if my work was critical and affecting the end date, I might not be at fault if my work couldn't proceed because a predecessor activity was incomplete. So by way of illustration, the framer has to wait for the concrete guys to finish the foundation. The drywaller has to wait for the framer. The framing is a predecessor activity to the drywall. Also, the painter has to wait for the drywallers to texture and do all that stuff with the walls before they can begin to do their painting. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of this concept of predecessor activities. Now let's put this in the context of the second coming. There are certain prophesied predecessor events that must occur before the second coming. We call them signs of the times, but they are things that must occur before the second coming can happen. Now, John goes screaming through, and sometimes it's going to feel like we're going at a very, very fast pace through some of this stuff, even though we're going really, really slow. But John goes through the second woe to the third woe to the second coming. It just assumes we know about all these predecessor activities that need to be done in order to get us to the second coming end date, but very often we don't. So our discussion of the second woe requires us to fill in the blanks from the writings and prophecies, for example, of Daniel, who in Daniel chapter 7 talks about Adam-ondi-Ahman. We need to know something about that particular gathering from the revelations given to Daniel, because if we don't understand what Daniel was saying about it, we have no clue as to how to begin to interpret the revelation by John in Revelation chapter 10. Also, we need to look at Daniel chapter 9 that talks about the 70 weeks prophecy that is going to detail for us some of the things that have to happen at the midpoint of Armageddon. Then we're going to be looking at other prophecies from latter-day Revelation found in the Doctrine and Covenants. So today, I'll touch on what I'm calling these predecessor activities leading to the second coming by way of overview. These events are those that must necessarily occur before or probably during the 7-year battle of Armageddon. So let's begin with the building of the temple in Jerusalem. You probably didn't immediately connect the construction of a temple with the Battle of Armageddon, because in your mind you have this vision of all things basically being destroyed and wiped out, but yet we have to have a temple built in Jerusalem. This is a very misunderstood event and doctrine both inside and outside the church. Prior to the midpoint of Armageddon, the Jews will gather to rebuild the third temple in Jerusalem, where they will again offer Mosaic-type sacrifices. President Wilford Woodruff places the construction of this temple in the context of the 7-year Battle of Armageddon, saying, quote, "The Jews have got to gather to their own land in unbelief. They will go and rebuild Jerusalem and their temple. They will take their gold and silver from the nations and will gather to the Holy Land. When they have done this and rebuilt their city, the Gentiles, in fulfillment of the words of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and other prophets, will go up against Jerusalem to battle and to take a spoil and a prey, and then, when they have taken 1/2 of Jerusalem captive and distressed the Jews for the last time on earth, their great deliverer, Shiloh, will come." Close quote. Now, as you're contemplating what President Woodruff said here, consider also a proclamation that was issued by the Quorum of the 12 Apostles on April 6, 1845. It addresses the construction of the same third temple by the Jews, but without the timing element provided by President Woodruff, saying, quote, "And we further testify that the Jews among all nations are hereby commanded, in the name of Messiah, to prepare to return to Jerusalem in Palestine and to rebuild that city and temple unto the Lord, and also to organize and establish their own political government under their own rulers, judges, and governors in that country." Close quote. Now, we've already seen the fulfillment of this charge for the Jews to return to Palestine to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, to establish their government, their rulers, judges, and governing officials. What they have not done yet is rebuild the third temple. Now, why do we call it the third temple? The first temple was built by Solomon, the son of King David, and this temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC when the Babylonians came in and took the Jews hostage. This coincides in time with the start of the Book of Mormon in 600 BC. The second temple, often called the Temple of Zerubbabel, was built by the Jews after they returned from the Babylonian captivity. This temple continued into the Roman era when King Herod expanded the size and the scope of the temple tremendously, and thus it became known as Herod's temple. But it was still the second temple because it was never destroyed. He simply expanded upon it. That second temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans as predicted by Jesus Christ, where he said there would not be one stone left standing on the other on the eve before his crucifixion. So that's how the second temple came to be destroyed, and now we're waiting for the third temple. If you were to Google third temple and try and get more information about what's going on with that, there's a lot of hullabaloo going on about it. Lots of information, lots of excitement. The Orthodox Jews are basically ready to go in and start just as soon as somebody gives them the high sign. John describes this third temple in Revelation 11:1, which he symbolically measures with a golden reed. The manner of John's measurements indicate that the Gentiles will besiege Jerusalem during the last 3.5 years of Armageddon, as has been predicted in other prophecies. The period of time, that is, this last 3.5 years, is frequently called the Great Tribulation. Revelation 11:2 describes this period, saying, quote, "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months." Close quote. The reference in this verse to the 42 months, of course, is 3.5 years. That is 12 months plus 12 months plus 12 months plus another 6 months equals 42 months or 3.5 years. Orson Pratt confirms the construction of the third temple and how it will be besieged during the Great Tribulation, or that last 3.5 years before the second coming, saying, quote, "After a while, when tens of thousands of them have gathered and rebuilt their temple and reestablished Jerusalem upon its own heap, the Lord will send forth amongst them a tremendous scourge." What will be the nature of that scourge? The nations that live in the regions round about Jerusalem will gather up like a cloud and cover all that land round about Jerusalem. They will come into the valley of Jehoshaphat, east of Jerusalem, and they will lay siege to the city. What then? The Lord will raise up 2 great prophets. They are called witnesses in the revelations of St. John. Will they have much power? Yes. During the days of their prophesying, they will have power to smite those who undertake to destroy them, and until their testimonies are fulfilled, they will be able to keep at bay all those nations besieging Jerusalem, so that they will not have power to take that city. How long will that be? 3.5 years, so says John the Revelator. Close quote. Now, Elder Pratt notes that during this Gentile siege, the 2 witnesses will minister in Jerusalem. John talks about them in detail in Revelation 11, verses 3 through 6. These are the guys that have the sealing power. They protect the city and the Jews for 42 months or 3.5 years. This is described in Revelation 11, 3 through 6. But we'll be talking more about their ministry later on when we get to chapter 11. For our overview purposes, we can note that the 3.5 year ministry of the two witnesses will end with their martyrdom. If you want to hear something that will kind of make your heart skip a beat or two, given the closeness that we all feel about the second coming, it's surely the case that these two witnesses have been born. They are mature men by this point in time, waiting for their call from the Lord to become the two witnesses in Jerusalem. And as I talk about later on, I conclude that they probably received that call at the time of the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman, because that's when their mission will commence. It will be immediately after the gathering at Adam-ondi-Ahman. So it's not like, they show up to the gathering and say, here's your mission call. You're called to serve in Jerusalem, and your mission starts, 3-6 months later. No, they're going to get their call and away they go. So after the period of their ministry, which is for 3.5 years, they will be killed. They will be martyred. They're dead. But how would you like to get your mission call saying, hey, you're one of the two witnesses. You better read chapter 11 because you're going to find out what's going to happen to you. A little bit of mixed feelings when you open that mission call, right? So at any rate, their dead bodies will remain unburied in Jerusalem for 3.5 days. That's described in Revelation 11, 7 through 10. After the two witnesses die, the Gentiles will commit these horrible atrocities against the Jews in the city of Jerusalem. This will be another abomination of desolation, and the Gentiles will destroy the third temple as the Romans destroyed the second temple and as Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple. This is what Christ was speaking of on the Mount of Olives in Matthew 24, on the evening before his crucifixion. Now, that account of Christ's prophecy is clarified in Joseph Smith Matthew 1, verses 32 and 33, which says, quote, "And again, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world." He's there talking about the restoration of the gospel in 1830. So we know that events now are describing things after 1830. So let me start again. "And again, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world, for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come," or the destruction of the wicked. "And again shall the latter day abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet be fulfilled." Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie elaborates on the fulfillment of this prophecy in a day that still lies in our future and that will occur at the very end of the second woe, saying, quote, "Then, speaking of the last days, following the restoration of the gospel and its declaration for a witness unto all nations, our Lord said, and again shall the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet be fulfilled." That is, Jerusalem again will be under siege. It will be during this siege that Christ will come. The wicked will be destroyed, and the millennial era commenced. Close quote. Now, the atrocities and the abomination that we're now talking about during the second woe will last 3.5 days and will abruptly end when the two witnesses are suddenly resurrected and a great earthquake will destroy much of Jerusalem as described in Revelation 11, 11 through 13, which I'll just quote here for your benefit. "And after 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven." Close quote. These are the events that mark the end of the second woe. After the great earthquake, John records in Revelation 11:14 that, quote, "The second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly." Close quote. The third woe coincides with the seventh and final trumpet angel of the seventh seal. And in Revelation 11:15 through 19, just to finish out those final few verses in chapter 11, John provides a brief introduction to the third woe, including the mention of Christ's second coming. However, the details of the third woe aren't given by John until Revelation chapter 15 and beyond. So there you have it, an overview of the second woe that we call Armageddon. In my next podcast, we'll begin to dive into the details of the battle, beginning with 2 verses in Revelation 9:13 and 14, where the sixth trumpet angel sounds and looses 4 destroying angels from the Euphrates River. That's what will trigger the Battle of Armageddon, and nothing we see in the wars today present such a trigger. So join me during my next podcast and invite your friends to join us also for an eye-opening excursion into the Battle of Armageddon. In the meantime, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing. And to Jen and Kristen, I will see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.